Racist flight attendant spills juice on black passenger, only to discover he owns the airline. This is a story that will leave you speechless, and what happens halfway through completely changes the ending. We'd love to know which city you're watching this video from, so drop it in the comments. While you're here, make sure to subscribe to the channel, give us a thumbs up, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with all our content. The morning was bright, with clear skies stretching across the horizon. As passengers gathered in the bustling Los Angeles International Airport, each person carried their own story, their own purpose, and their own destination. Among them was Elijah Thompson, a distinguished, well-dressed black man in his early 40s. He moved with a quiet confidence, drawing a few glances his way as he strode to his gate. What people didn't know was that Elijah wasn't just any passenger. He was, in fact, the CEO and majority owner of Skybound Airlines, an airline company that he had built from the ground up. But Elijah believed in simplicity and never flaunted his success. Dressed in a comfortable, understated suit and carrying a worn leather briefcase, he looked just like any other traveler. He preferred to observe his business from the ground level, so he often traveled in economy class, sitting shoulder to shoulder with regular passengers, soaking up their experiences with the airline he had dedicated his life to building. On this particular day, Elijah was traveling to New York for a high-profile business conference where he planned to announce a new line of eco-friendly planes. As he boarded the plane and found his seat, he noticed the flight crew bustling around, getting ready for takeoff. Little did he know, this flight would test his patience, his principles, and his beliefs in ways he had never anticipated. One of the flight attendants, Lindsay Harper, caught Elijah's eye. Tall and impeccably groomed, Lindsay had been working for Skybound Airlines for nearly 10 years. She was known among her colleagues for her efficiency and sharp eye, but also for a certain coolness towards certain passengers. Elijah observed her as she helped other passengers, noting her strict, almost rigid demeanor. Lindsay had a reputation for being courteous, but only selectively so, and Elijah was curious to see how this would manifest in her interactions during the flight. As Lindsay moved through the aisle, greeting passengers and checking overhead compartments, her eyes fell on Elijah. She gave him a quick, dismissive glance, barely nodding before moving to the next row. Elijah, used to subtle slights, shrugged it off, preferring to observe quietly rather than react immediately. He had dealt with these situations countless times before, but as the owner of the airline, he made it a point to see how employees treated passengers when they thought no one was watching. After the plane took off, Lindsay began serving drinks, meticulously preparing the trays with a sharp, rehearsed precision. When she reached Elijah's row, she paused, eyeing him with a barely concealed look of disdain. It was subtle but unmistakable. Elijah felt the tension simmer as he politely asked for a glass of orange juice. Instead of responding with a simple "of course" like she had with the other passengers, Lindsay pursed her lips, as if annoyed by his presence. She reached for the juice and poured it, but as she extended her arm to hand it to him, her hand accidentally jerked, spilling the cold juice all over Elijah's suit. "Oh, I'm sorry," Lindsay said with a tone that lacked any real remorse. Her eyes held a faint smirk, as if she took a certain satisfaction in seeing him drenched. "I guess these things happen." Elijah looked down at his soaked clothes, took a deep breath, and maintained his composure. "No problem," he replied calmly, reaching for a napkin to dab at the juice on his suit. "Accidents happen." But Lindsay's demeanor didn't improve. Throughout the flight, she continued to treat Elijah with thinly veiled disrespect, avoiding eye contact and giving curt responses. It was clear to Elijah that Lindsay's behavior was fueled by prejudice, and he could feel the eyes of other passengers turning toward them, sensing the tension. Elijah, however, maintained his quiet dignity, choosing not to escalate the situation. Little did Lindsay know, her actions were being observed by more than just curious passengers. By the time the plane touched down in New York, Elijah had made a decision. He planned to address this issue, not only to Lindsay but to the entire company. But he would do it on his own terms. As passengers disembarked, Lindsay continued her duties, unaware of who Elijah truly was. She went about her tasks with a sense of superiority, satisfied with her actions. She had no idea that her life was about to take a dramatic turn. When Elijah stepped off the plane, He turned to look at Lindsay one last time, his expression calm and composed. "Thank you for the service," he said, his tone polite but layered with an intensity that Lindsay didn't fully understand. She barely acknowledged him, still oblivious to the consequences of her actions. As Elijah left the airport, he dialed his assistant, Marco. Marco had been with Elijah since the early days of Skybound and knew him better than anyone else. "Marco, I want you to arrange a special staff meeting at headquarters," Elijah instructed. "And make sure the entire crew from Flight 739 is there, including Lindsay Harper." Marco was silent for a moment, sensing the seriousness in Elijah's voice. "Of course, sir. Shall I inform them of the reason?" "Not yet. Just make sure everyone is present. I want to address something that needs immediate attention." For the next few days, Elijah went about his business in New York, attending meetings and preparing for his upcoming conference. However, in his spare moments, he meticulously planned his approach to confronting the issue. He believed in fairness and accountability, values he had instilled in every corner of his company. The airline industry was notoriously tough, but he had built Skybound with integrity and respect as its foundation, and he would not allow any cracks to undermine it. Back at Skybound headquarters, the staff was buzzing with rumors. Word had spread that Elijah himself had called a sudden meeting, and everyone was speculating about the purpose. Lindsay, however, was unfazed. She went about her tasks with her usual detachment, assuming the meeting would be a routine briefing. On the day of the meeting, employees filled the conference room, and a tense silence settled over the room as Elijah entered, his gaze scanning each face with calm intensity. Lindsay noticed his arrival and rolled her eyes slightly, failing to connect the dots. She had no reason to suspect that this man, whom she had looked down upon during the flight, was actually her boss. When everyone was seated, Elijah began to speak, his voice steady but laced with a gravity that demanded attention. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he said. "I've gathered you here today to discuss a matter that deeply concerns the values and standards of Skybound Airlines. Recently, I was on one of our flights as a passenger. I observed the service, the treatment, and the professionalism, or lack thereof, displayed by some members of the crew. The room was filled with uncomfortable shifting as people began to glance around, wondering who he might be referring to. Lindsay's confidence started to waver as Elijah's words continued to cut through the room like a knife. She looked around, noticing a few of her colleagues exchanging worried glances. Elijah paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. His gaze swept across the room, lingering just long enough on Lindsay to make her shift uneasily in her seat. She still didn't realize the full extent of what was unfolding, but a flicker of doubt crossed her face. "In my time with Skybound," Elijah began, his tone carrying both authority and disappointment, "I have always emphasized that every single passenger is to be treated with respect and dignity, no matter their background, appearance, or any preconceived notions we may harbor. It is not only a matter of professionalism, but of human decency." Lindsay swallowed hard. Her colleagues turned their attention toward her now, realizing that this reprimand might be directed at her. Some murmured quietly, aware of her reputation for selective courtesy. She sat straighter, trying to appear indifferent, but her fingers fidgeted as her confidence began to crack. Elijah continued, "A situation occurred on Flight 739, where a passenger was treated in a way that goes against everything this company stands for. Prejudice, no matter how subtle or disguised, has no place within Skybound Airlines. It's not just a rule, it's a core value. And when someone breaks that value, they are challenging the very foundation of this company." Lindsay's face grew pale, and her expression shifted from indifference to genuine concern. She began to realize that this wasn't just a general address. This was personal, directed at her. The room fell silent, each person's attention riveted to Elijah as he leaned forward, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Miss Lindsay Harper," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "I am referring to you." Gasps and whispers filled the room as Lindsay's face flushed with shock. Her mind raced, and she struggled to find words, but nothing came. She had never considered that the man she had treated with such disdain was anyone of importance, let alone the CEO and owner of the very airline she worked for. Elijah didn't give her a chance to respond. As the owner of this airline, I travel undercover in economy class to understand the experience of every passenger on my flights. That day, I was observing not just the journey but how our employees treat those who rely on us. And I was deeply disappointed to witness your actions firsthand. Lindsay stammered, "Sir, I had no idea." "That's precisely the problem," Elijah interrupted, his tone unyielding. "You assumed that the man in a plain suit, sitting quietly in economy, didn't deserve the same respect you would afford someone else. That assumption led you to pour juice on me, not by accident, but with intent. I saw it in your eyes, in your actions. And that's the kind of prejudice I cannot and will not tolerate in my company." Lindsay's face was now a deep shade of red as her colleague's eyes bore into her. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to explain, but Elijah's steady gaze silenced her. After a tense silence, Elijah addressed the entire room. "Let this be a lesson to everyone here. We work in an industry that brings people from all walks of life together. It's our duty, our obligation, to ensure that every passenger feels welcome, safe, and respected. If we can't do that, then we have failed, and that failure falls on each and every one of us." Turning back to Lindsay, Elijah spoke in a measured tone. "As of this moment, Lindsay, you are suspended pending a full review. If we find this behavior to be part of a pattern, you will no longer be welcome at Skybound Airlines." Lindsay felt her stomach drop as his words sank in. She had never anticipated this outcome, never imagined that one moment of prejudice could jeopardize her entire career. With her head lowered, she murmured, I understand." As Lindsay left the room, shamefaced and subdued, Elijah turned back to the remaining employees, his expression softening slightly. "Let this experience remind us that respect and kindness should be extended to all, without exception. We are a team, and we're stronger when we lift each other up." With the meeting adjourned, the employees slowly filed out, some in silent contemplation, others whispering among themselves. Elijah stayed behind, letting the gravity of what had transpired settle over him. He hoped that this incident would spark a change not only within the airline but within each person present. The days following her letter to Elijah marked the beginning of a profound internal journey for Lindsay. With each passing moment, she felt the weight of her mistakes but also sensed a growing resolve within herself, a determination to understand, to change, and to confront her own prejudices. The path was difficult, but Lindsay was committed to peeling back the layers of her own assumptions and addressing the harmful beliefs that had shaped her actions for so long. After mailing the letter, Lindsay waited anxiously for a response. Every day, she checked her email, hoping for some acknowledgement, some sign that Elijah had read her apology and understood the sincerity behind her words. But days passed, then weeks, and there was no reply. This silence gnawed at her, deepening her feelings of guilt and unworthiness. She had reached out with a vulnerability she had never allowed herself to feel before, and yet, the absence of a response left her feeling raw and exposed. During this time, Lindsay's life became a solitary pursuit of self-improvement and reflection. She withdrew from her usual routines and social circles, finding that her former lifestyle, filled with lighthearted outings and casual conversations with colleagues, now felt hollow. Every interaction she remembered, every past conversation with friends and family, seemed tinged with a superficiality she hadn't previously noticed. It was as if she was seeing the world through new eyes, eyes that now recognized how often she had judged others, even unconsciously. Driven by a desire to make sense of her inner turmoil, Lindsay immersed herself in books, articles, and studies on social psychology, racial bias, and empathy. She found herself especially drawn to first-hand accounts of people who had faced discrimination, reading about the painful and often subtle ways prejudice manifested in everyday interactions. These stories opened her eyes further, and she felt a pang of regret each time she saw herself mirrored in the actions of others. She began to understand that her biases were not just personal flaws but reflections of broader societal attitudes that she had internalized without question. One particular story struck her deeply. A young Black woman recounted an experience of being ignored repeatedly by service staff, as if she were invisible. The woman described the quiet humiliation, the frustration of being treated as unworthy of acknowledgement. Lindsay saw herself in the actions of those service workers, remembering the moments she had dismissed passengers without even realizing the hurt she might be causing. The story resonated so strongly with Lindsay that she wept, feeling the impact of her own behavior as if experiencing it for the first time. But reading and understanding were only the beginning. Lindsay knew she needed to take action if she truly wanted to change. She began attending workshops and seminars on diversity, equity, and inclusion, seeking to understand how these concepts could be applied in her work and daily life. These sessions were eye-opening, challenging her in ways she had never anticipated. She listened as speakers shared their experiences of systemic discrimination, the ways in which biases seeped into institutions, and how even well-meaning people could perpetuate harm through unconscious actions. Each story deepened her understanding of the real impact of prejudice and her role in it. In one particularly powerful session, the facilitator asked participants to share a time they felt they had wronged someone based on assumptions. Lindsay felt her hands grow cold as she prepared to speak, her heart pounding with the weight of her own story. When her turn came, she recounted her experience with Elijah, sparing no detail of her actions and their painful consequences. She admitted her guilt, her shame, and the long-overdue realization of the harm she had caused. As she spoke, she noticed nods of understanding and empathy from others in the group, and though the experience was humbling, she felt a small sense of relief in unburdening herself. It was a first step, a step toward healing and accountability. In the days following this seminar, Lindsay began implementing small but meaningful changes in her interactions with others. She practiced active listening, a skill she realized she had neglected. Instead of making assumptions, she asked questions, taking time to understand the people she encountered, both in her personal life and in the professional settings she attended while on suspension. She realized how much she had overlooked in her previous role, how often she had gone through the motions without truly connecting with the passengers she served. Each interaction now became an opportunity for growth, a chance to test her commitment to treating others with respect and openness. Lindsay started volunteering with local organizations focused on community outreach and social justice, determined to make a positive impact. She worked with groups advocating for fair treatment in the workplace and participated in programs designed to help underrepresented groups feel empowered. Through these experiences, she learned to see people not through the lens of her assumptions, but through a genuine understanding of their unique stories and perspectives. One day, during her volunteer work, she met a man named Marcus who had experienced discrimination in multiple workplaces. Marcus was a former airline pilot who had left the industry due to constant microaggressions and the silent but persistent biases he faced. Hearing his story was both painful and enlightening for Lindsay. Marcus spoke about the exhaustion of having to constantly prove his worth in an environment that often viewed him as different or other. He shared the mental and emotional toll this had taken on him over the years, how it had affected his self-esteem and his passion for his job. Listening to Marcus, Lindsay felt a deep sense of empathy and remorse. She understood now that her actions on Flight 739 were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern of treatment that people like Marcus endured daily. She realized that her behavior had contributed to a culture that devalued individuals based on superficial judgments, and she felt a renewed commitment to dismantling that culture within herself and, hopefully, within her workplace if given the chance. As the weeks passed, Lindsay's transformation deepened. She began to view her role as a flight attendant through a new lens, recognizing that her job was not just about providing service, but about creating a welcoming environment for every passenger. She understood now that every interaction, no matter how brief, could either uplift or diminish someone, depending on how she approached it. Her commitment to empathy grew stronger, and with it, a quiet sense of purpose began to take root. Eventually, her former colleagues began to notice the change in Lindsay. She reached out to a few trusted coworkers, sharing her journey and the steps she was taking to become a more inclusive and compassionate person. Some were skeptical, remembering her previous attitude, but others saw the sincerity in her eyes and the dedication in her actions. Slowly, word spread about her transformation, and her colleagues began to see her not as the rigid, often judgmental flight attendant she once was, but as someone genuinely committed to making amends. One afternoon, while reflecting on her journey, Lindsay received an unexpected email. It was from Elijah's office. Her heart raced as she opened it, reading the carefully worded response that acknowledged her letter and invited her to meet with him in person to discuss her future with Skybound Airlines. Elijah's tone was professional but conveyed a subtle openness, a willingness to hear her out and perhaps offer her a chance at redemption. The chapter closed with Lindsay preparing for this meeting, her heart filled with both apprehension and hope. She knew that her journey was far from over, but she also knew that this meeting represented an opportunity, a chance to prove, not just to Elijah, but to herself, that she had truly changed. As she prepared to face him once more, Lindsay felt a newfound strength within her, a determination rooted in humility, empathy, and a commitment to live up to the values she had once ignored. The day of the meeting with Elijah Thompson finally arrived, and Lindsay Harper could feel the weight of its significance pressing down on her. She spent the morning in nervous preparation, carefully selecting her attire and rehearsing what she wanted to say. This meeting was more than a mere formality. It was an opportunity to prove that the person she was now was different from the one who had acted with prejudice and disrespect on Flight 739. Lindsay understood that this was her chance for redemption, a second chance to rebuild her career, and most importantly, to show Elijah that his confrontation had ignited a genuine transformation within her. As she approached the Skybound Airlines headquarters, her nerves intensified. She took deep breaths, steadying herself as she walked through the doors, the familiar surroundings now seeming foreign and intimidating. Memories of her time at Skybound, of her interactions with passengers, and especially of that fateful flight flooded her mind. Each memory reminded her of the mistakes she had made, and each step forward reinforced her resolve to make things right. When she reached the meeting room, Elijah was already seated, his demeanor calm yet unreadable. He greeted her with a nod, and she noticed that his gaze held both the authority of a CEO and the intensity of someone deeply committed to his company's values. This was the man she had wronged, the man she had disrespected with her actions, yet here he was, offering her the chance to explain herself. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Mr. Thompson," Lindsay began, her voice steady but laced with humility. "I know that I am here today because of my actions, and I want you to know that I take full responsibility for what happened on Flight 739. I've had a lot of time to reflect, and I've come to understand how deeply I failed, not just you, but the principles Skybound stands for." Elijah listened, his expression thoughtful. He didn't interrupt, allowing her to continue, and Lindsay could feel the weight of his scrutiny. She knew that her words alone would not be enough to convince him. It was the sincerity behind them, the commitment to change, that would matter. Lindsay went on, sharing details of her journey over the past few weeks, the self-reflection she had undertaken, and the steps she had been taking to confront her biases. She spoke of the workshops she had attended, the books and articles she had read, and the volunteer work she had undertaken to gain a deeper understanding of the impact of prejudice. Each word was a piece of her soul, laid bare for Elijah to see. She was honest about her struggles, about how difficult it had been to face the uncomfortable truths about herself, and about how committed she was to making lasting changes. "I've come to realize that my actions were not just unprofessional, they were a violation of human decency. I assumed things about you, about other passengers, without taking the time to see them as individuals, as people deserving of respect," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I've hurt people with my actions, and I am deeply sorry. I am committed to continuing this journey, to ensuring that no one I interact with is ever treated the way I treated you." There was a pause as Elijah took in her words. Lindsay watched him closely, searching his face for any sign of his thoughts. She knew that this decision wasn't easy for him. He had a responsibility to uphold the values of his company, and she represented a breach of those values. Yet, she hoped he could see her sincerity, that he could recognize the depth of her commitment to change. After a moment, Elijah spoke. "Lindsay, I appreciate your honesty. It takes courage to face oneself, to acknowledge flaws that are difficult to admit. I can see that you have taken significant steps to address your biases, and that is a start. But as you know, true change is not a single moment. It's a continuous process." Lindsay nodded, fully understanding the gravity of his words. "I realize that, sir. I know that this journey isn't over. I am committed to proving, through my actions, that I have learned and that I am willing to keep learning, Elijah's gaze softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. As the CEO of Skybound, it is my duty to ensure that our team embodies our values. This company was built on the principles of respect, inclusivity, and empathy, and every employee is a representative of those values. What happened on Flight 739 was unacceptable, but I believe that people are capable of change, provided they are truly committed to it. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. I am willing to give you a second chance, Lindsay, but it will not be a simple return to your former role. I believe you need an opportunity to truly understand the impact of your actions and to rebuild trust, both with your colleagues and with our passengers. I am offering you a position in our customer relations department. You'll be working directly with passengers who have faced discrimination or unfair treatment. You will listen to their stories, learn from their experiences, and ensure that they feel heard and valued. The shift in her role was unexpected, and Lindsay felt a wave of surprise mixed with gratitude. This wasn't just a job assignment. It was a chance to work toward redemption, a structured path that would allow her to make amends in a tangible way. She recognized the significance of Elijah's decision. This role would allow her to see firsthand the effects of discrimination and prejudice, to connect with those who had been marginalized and dismissed, much as she had once done to him. I accept this position, Mr. Thompson, she replied earnestly. Thank you for trusting me with this opportunity. I promise you, I won't let you down. Elijah nodded, a slight smile breaking through his otherwise serious demeanor. Then consider this a fresh start, Lindsay. I expect you to approach this role with the same dedication you have shown in confronting your biases. You will report to the head of customer relations and undergo ongoing training in diversity, equity, and inclusion. We will be monitoring your progress, and I expect to see a consistent commitment to the values we stand for. As the meeting concluded, Lindsay felt a mixture of relief and determination. She had been given a lifeline, an opportunity to not only redeem herself, but to actively contribute to a culture of inclusivity and respect within Skybound. She knew that this role in customer relations would be challenging, perhaps even emotionally taxing, but it was precisely what she needed. This was her chance to rebuild, to transform the guilt she felt into meaningful action. Walking out of the meeting, Lindsay took a deep breath. She felt lighter, yet more grounded. The path ahead was clear, though difficult, and she was ready to face it with humility and determination. She was no longer the person who had dismissed and disrespected others based on shallow assumptions. She was on a journey of self-discovery, of understanding, and of empathy. A journey that she was willing to commit to, for as long as it took. The following week, Lindsay began her training in the customer relations department. Her first task was to undergo extensive training in active listening, conflict resolution, and cultural sensitivity. The training sessions were intense, delving deeply into the ways subtle biases could influence interactions, and Lindsay found herself both challenged and enlightened by the material. She was required to role-play scenarios in which passengers felt mistreated, learning how to listen, validate their feelings, and offer sincere apologies. Each exercise forced her to confront her own past actions, and she threw herself into the work, determined to learn as much as she could. During her first few days on the job, Lindsay was assigned to a team that handled customer complaints and feedback. Her role was to listen to passengers who had faced various forms of discrimination or unfair treatment during their flights. She spent hours each day listening to their stories, some of which were heart-wrenching. She heard from passengers who had been ignored, dismissed, or treated poorly simply because of their appearance, background, or circumstances. Each story mirrored aspects of her own actions, and each one deepened her understanding of the pain she had once caused. One afternoon, a passenger named Claire called in to report an experience she had on a recent flight, where a flight attendant had treated her with visible disdain due to her visible tattoos and unconventional appearance. Claire's voice was laced with frustration and sadness as she recounted the feeling of being judged, of having her worth reduced to mere appearances. Lindsay listened intently, her heart aching with empathy. She offered an apology on behalf of the airline, acknowledging Claire's feelings and assuring her that her feedback would be taken seriously. For the first time, Lindsay felt the profound impact of simply listening and validating someone's experience. She realized that her new role was not just about apologizing, It was about making people feel valued, about restoring the dignity that had been taken from them. With each conversation, Lindsay felt herself growing, her empathy deepening, her understanding expanding. She was beginning to internalize the importance of seeing each person as a unique individual, worthy of respect and compassion. Her interactions with passengers were no longer mechanical or superficial. They were sincere, heartfelt, and driven by a genuine desire to help. As Chapter 6 concluded, Lindsay was not only gaining practical skills in customer relations, but was also transforming on a personal level. Her second chance was becoming a journey of redemption, where each day brought her closer to the person she aspired to be, someone who saw others with empathy, who listened without judgment, and who valued every person for who they were. This was no longer just a job. It was her path to atonement, and she was ready to walk it with dedication and humility. In her new role, Lindsay was exposed to the daily challenges and frustrations that many passengers experienced. She listened to countless stories of people who felt dismissed, ignored, or unfairly treated, and each story struck a chord. Slowly, her empathy grew, and she began to approach her work with a newfound sense of purpose. Through her interactions, Lindsay learned to see beyond superficial judgments, understanding the richness of each person's background and experiences. Over time, she became a fierce advocate for inclusivity and respect, her previous biases replaced by a dedication to ensuring that every passenger felt valued. A year later, Elijah observed Lindsay from afar as she interacted warmly with passengers. Her demeanor transformed. She had become one of the most empathetic members of the customer relations team, earning respect and admiration from her colleagues and passengers alike. Elijah decided it was time to publicly acknowledge Lindsay's transformation. At an annual company event, he shared her story, not to shame her but to highlight the power of growth and redemption. Lindsay, now humbled and moved, felt a deep gratitude for the second chance Elijah had given her. Inspired by Lindsay's journey, Skybound Airlines implemented a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program, training all employees to recognize and overcome biases. Lindsay became a spokesperson for the initiative, sharing her story openly, using her experiences to inspire others to embrace empathy and understanding. Skybound's new policies became industry standards, elevating the airline's reputation and setting a new benchmark for respect and inclusivity. Elijah's initial confrontation with Lindsay had sparked a chain reaction, one that reshaped the company's culture and positively impacted countless lives. Years later, Lindsay, now a respected leader within the company, sat across from a young flight attendant during a training session. She recognized the same rigid confidence she had once held. The attendant made an offhand comment about a passenger that struck a familiar, uncomfortable chord. Lindsay leaned forward, her gaze steady but compassionate. "I know where you're coming from," she said, "but let me tell you a story." As she shared her own journey, Lindsay felt a sense of purpose and fulfillment that went beyond her career. She had transformed, and now, she was using her story to guide others on a path she had once resisted. In the end, Elijah's decision to confront her, to give her that second chance, had rippled outward, creating a legacy that defined not just her, but the entire culture of Skybound Airlines.